Well, the next presentation is by Mary Ann Denton. She's a one-person team, bioassessment team in the state of Nevada. In fact, the next two presentations are going to be one-people teams where we forget how lucky we are here in California to have, an expansive, fairly expansive bioassessment program. And we forget about the efforts of some of our neighboring states. So again, I mentioned California, Nevada, Arizona, Hawaii. They're all part of Region 9 of the EPA. And if, for those of you who don't understand, water quality funding usually comes from the EPA, and of course they have a lot of influence on what a state does. So Mary Ann Denton's the title of her talk is Dry, Dusty, and Determined. She's given presentations before. She's very, very good, very entertaining, which you have to be if you're from Nevada, right?
Absolutely.
Like, what do they have? Oh, yeah, they have gambling.
Right. Well, entertainment is Nevada's
Entertainment,
number one
there you go.
industry.
So Mary Ann Denton is going to be our next presenter.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mary Ann Denton. I missed Jim's introduction of me, so hopefully it was good. I am the bioassessment coordinator for the state of Nevada, and I've been doing this for about 2.5 years. And I will be honest, I actually came up with the title of the presentation because I thought it sounded so awesome before I actually put the presentation together. So hopefully it's going to work. So in any case, Dry, Dusty, and Determined, and that came from one of my interns this summer because we had a heck of a time finding our NRSA sites, National Rivers and Streams Assessment sites at some locations because of how dry it was. Okay, I want to thank some people, and I know this sounds like pandering, but Jim, thank you for hosting this. This really is the best conference that I have been to, both in my graduate research and bioassessment work. It's great to hear about what you're doing here in California, and I take it back to Nevada, and I'm so excited. I'm like, look what they're doing with their stream condition index. It's awesome. We can do that here in Nevada soon. And my boss is like, yes, I think that might happen in 7 to 10 years. And I have different plans for my life in 7 to 10 years. So I want to thank my interns from this past summer. What a great group of young stream ecologists. And they actually gave me this photograph blown up on canvas, taken up in the Jarbidge River, as a thank you for the time I spent with them this summer. So how could you not love young people like that? I'd like to thank my colleague, Zach Blumberg, who's here today. He helps me out with the bioassessment program. And when you put a very serious geologist with a crazy ecologist, interesting things will happen. My predecessor, Karen Vargas, many of you whom you know, she did a lot of the work I'll talk about today. Chuck Hawkins and Jake at Utah State for the development of our predictive models. And of course, EPA Region 9 for their support. Okay, this is on the Bruno River. It's a gomphid for those of you who do not love odonates like I do. And it's a beautiful thing when you go to a river. And one of the things I really impressed on my interns is don't jump in and start working. Walk the banks of your rivers and streams. Look at what's happening there. And don't look up here, look down here. And so we came up to the Bruno River in late June, and here he is. He has walked up to this rock, and one of the things that gomphids do, well, I'm sure other odonates do it as well, is for locomotion, they've got a little jet propulsion by expelling water out their anus. But you can see the water stream, his abdomen is curled up here, and the water stream is hitting this rock. And I found this to be unusual, because I've seen them sort of jet propel themselves through streams, but I'd never seen this before. And so we stood there for 45 minutes watching dragonfly emergence. And it was the most magical morning to take these 3 young students to this river and watch ecology in action, watching these, what I consider are the most awesome aquatic predators invertebrate predators, emerge into these amazing terrestrial insects. And it's hard to get into the stream because you don't want to disturb that. My colleagues know that when I scoop up the bug net and I look in there, and I have this visceral response about putting invertebrates into ethanol, and I talk them through it. I'm like, I'm sorry that I'm killing you today. And so, but it really was just a beautiful, wonderful morning and a great experience that I was able to share with some amazing interns. Okay, another odonate thing here. This is an algal mat on the Humboldt River, and damselflies, which are Nevada's state insects, were laying their egg masses here on the algal mat. It was great to watch that too, but not as exciting as the emergence. So a little outline about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about where we went this past summer, where we've been. I'm going to specifically focus on the Humboldt Basin and talk about conditions there, flow conditions there, what we know, and what we're going to learn. So I'm going to be talking about some statistics using a particular program, and I'm comparing our reference condition with flow regimes. So we'll get to that here, where we went. This is one of my Facebook postings, status postings at the end of September. I put over 11,000 miles on my work truck this summer. That's 11,000 miles of beautiful Nevada. And sometimes it's the same mile, 3, 4, 10 times. But you always see something great. It's going to be a pronghorn or a badger or a Burning Man art car. You know, it's really a great place to see things, and you see amazing things. We did 19 national rivers and stream sites for the EPA survey. We had 30 assigned to us. In the blue dots, those are our 20 Nevada-specific sites. And then we had 16 dry sites, and actually, those two sites up on the Humboldt River were about 5 kilometers apart and completely dry, not a drop of water. So where we went, the mighty Humboldt Basin, I'm going to again talk about how does flow regime affect reference condition scores, and based on my modified ecoregion. And so Utah State did develop an ODE model for us and an MMI. I'm using the MMI because they found that was more sensitive to reference conditions in Nevada than the ODE was. So, mighty Humboldt Basin. The Humboldt Basin, since it was settled way back in the mid-1800s, is an area of rich natural resources. And it's still very heavily used for resource extraction right now. And this quote from the newspaper in 1870 talks about the Lahontan cutthroat trout in the Humboldt River, that there was so much trout and so abundant in this river, but now there's scarcely any fish to be found, slaughtered with nets and traps. And that really has been the history of resource extraction in the Humboldt. It is, we have the largest gold mines in North America in the Humboldt. Noble Energy has 6 exploratory fracking wells just starting up right now. Livestock grazing, land use for agriculture. So it's very, again, rich in resource extraction. And of course, as we know, those resource extractions really do affect water quality. So it's larger than the state of Maryland, so over 16,000 square miles. And the Humboldt River itself is starting up by Wells, Nevada, and eastern Nevada, up here. And it says that it's 310 miles from here to here. But that's not the most accurate representation from the headwaters to the sink. It is the longest river within state boundaries, starting and ending. And it says 310 miles. However, the Army Corps of Engineers in one particular valley that is 130 miles long, this valley, found that the river itself was 300 miles long in that 130-mile valley because it meanders and it's very sinuous, and it's just breaking up into channels and things like that. So it's just meanders all over the place. And we have 107 biosites up in the Humboldt Basin. A majority of Nevada's waters are in the Humboldt Basin. So last year, when I was here, I talked about categorizing things not on hydrologic basin, but on a sort of a melding of ecoregion level 3, which I feel is too coarse, and ecoregion level 4, which I think is too refined. And so I've made 14, I call them ecoregion 3.5s for Nevada, and there's actually 5 of them in the Humboldt Basin, but today I'm going to focus on 3. And to give you just a brief outline, what I did was I take, for example, I'm going to talk about the upper Humboldt area here. What I would do is I took an area of elevation that is the lowest elevation in an area and then work my way up as it surrounds the mountains. It works really well in Nevada because we have this basin and range sort of a landscape. And so in the upper Humboldt here, for example, majority of the lower elevation area is 13M. And so that's going to be where the Humboldt River is, a lot of agricultural land. It's lower elevation. And then work myself up to 13N, 13O is the highest elevations in the Rubies. And so those are all put together. So again, in the Humboldt Basin, there are 5 ecoregions, 3.5, that I've developed. And I'm going to talk about the upper Humboldt, the Central Basin here, and then the Lahontan Plains, which is very low elevation. And to talk about elevation as well, again, the upper Humboldt, you have the Ruby Mountains, the Independence Range, a lot of first order streams, smaller streams going into the main stem of the Humboldt, but a lot of higher elevation streams. So this is the spread of the streams that I'll be talking about in terms of elevation. Central Basin, again, a lot of high elevation streams. The main stem of the Humboldt River doesn't even go through, even though it's part of the Humboldt Basin, doesn't even go through the central region. And that's characterized by the Twabes, again, very high elevation. And I mentioned the Lahontan Plains, very low, very dry area. More water is actually withdrawn from the Humboldt River for different uses than goes into it. This is on the crest of the Ruby Range. It's a granitic range. This is looking northwest and west. This is up on the crest of the Twabes. I stitched this together from my summer travels. It's looking northwest and southeast. And this is what the Humboldt ends up as. This picture was taken from a hilltop in May 2012. So, you know, when you should have the highest flows, right? And this is the Humboldt, Lake Humboldt. And this is what our Humboldt River ends up as. As my colleague Zach says, Nevada, the place where great rivers go to die. So, okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about flows for select water years because, again, I'm comparing the MMI reference conditions to flows for select water years. So, I have low flow, and this is only during the bioassessment program in Nevada, which has been since about 2000. So I went through and I looked at flows over the years, the last 62 years, and came up with low years, which is 2003, 2004, high years, 2005, 2006, and then a 62-year average based on monthly mean statistics from these 3 USGS gauges on the main stem of the Humboldt. So representing the upper Humboldt Plains is the Carlin gauge. The numbers next to the gauge names is the amount of square mileage that area drains into. So you can see it's, even during the low years, it's not that much different than the average years, but the high years, you can see it's about 2.5 times more than the average. The Battle Mountain gauge, this is where the Reese River is going to go into the Humboldt River, so you're getting a big pulse of water from the Twabes on a good year with the snow. And the Imlay gauge is about 5 miles east of Rye Patch Reservoir, which captures the final last drops of the Humboldts. And you can see that it's always very low flows there. Even, you have the good years, but on low and average years, it's very low flows into the Humboldt River. So what I'm going to be comparing again, the flows to the reference condition. I have some statistics that I'm using, and a program I use is called Primary, and it was developed by Warwick and Clark for marine benthic communities, but it's a good way to compare benthic communities. So I have a non-parametric multidimensional scaling plot. It drives me nuts because I want to know what my axes are, but they don't have axes. But essentially, it ranks the similarities between samples, and those samples will show up dots on the figure. And the further apart they are, the more dissimilar they are. And then I have analysis of similarity. It compares the variation in species between samples, and you get an R value. Now, there's so many R's in statistics, it gets confusing to me. But essentially, the R value is between -1 and 1. So if you're at the extremes of -1 and 1, then that is showing that your samples are dissimilar. The closer you are to 0, your samples are very much alike. And then there's percent of similarity, and this shows what species contributes to the differences between samples. For example, when I was working up at Lake Tahoe, if I took a sample from an Asian clam bed and took a sample from a place where there were no Asian clams, it would show Asian clams as being the dominant species there, contributing to the most be the species contributing the most to the dissimilarity between those two samples. So if you want to know more about this primary, go ahead and talk to me afterwards, but that's the best I can do right now. Okay, so here's one of those plots, and again, no axis, but I've put the different regions here. The Lahontan Plains are in green, Upper Humboldt is in blue, and the central region is sort of in this mustard color. And you look at this and you go, well, what does this mean to me? And again, how close the samples are together is how alike those samples are. And this is just for the select water years, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. So you look at this and go, well, what is this telling me? Well, you can see there are some groupings. You can see the Lahontan area does group a little bit further to the left of the graph, and the central area is a little bit to the right of the graph. But further groupings show that this cluster here are mainly higher elevation sites, about 87% reference, and the rest are impaired sites. But these are generally sites that are at the higher elevation first order stream. This grouping here are mainly lower elevations, and you can see a lot of that is Lahontan Plains. And it's about 70% reference, and the rest are either undetermined or impaired. And this is based on our MMI predictive model. And so these sites are all 100% impaired, but this right here are lower, and this is up here is higher. So they do tend to group. The grouping gives you an idea how close those sites are together. And so when I go through and do the statistics for the analysis similarity based comparing the MMI to the different ecoregions, and remember 0 means those sites are like exactly alike. Closer to -1 or 1 means they're very dissimilar. And there really isn't anything significant between all of the ecoregions. The Upper Humboldt to the central, it's just 0.1. Again, both places have very high elevation first order streams. The Upper Humboldt to Lahontan, not a lot of dissimilarity there either, because they both share the main stem of the Humboldt. You have obviously a serious connectivity there. But the central to Lahontan is 0.5. Different from Lahontan to central. So those sites are very not alike. And then when I do my percent of similarity, there's nothing significant about any of these percentages for me to say that, wow, these are very, very different areas. So again, I'm just going to go through the 3 areas. The Upper Humboldt, you can see here, the red, that's low flow years, but there's still a lot of references sites in the low flow years. The blue are high flow years, and the yellow is just average years. And so I'm wondering, okay, is flow going to affect whether it's reference or impaired? And here you can see a lot of reference sites, so I'm not getting that this is particularly impaired based on that being very low flow years. And again, the statistics are not standing out to me going, wow, something's really going on here. Here we have a little stonefly from Lamoille Creek up in Lamoille Canyon, Ruby Mountains, and he's eking out a living with a lot of didymo on that rock. But one of the things that did stand out was, and this is kind of a duh moment, that you can see between the lowest elevation and the highest elevation, those are only about 10% the same. Well, of course, because you're dealing with Lamoille Creek, first order stream, close to the headwaters, and the Humboldt River. So there is some statistical things that stand out to me there. So I'm thinking that it's a good idea to segregate on elevation as well. Central, and this is the area again that doesn't have the main stem of the Humboldt through it, very high elevations. And I wanted to point out the utility of using this particular program, because even though we have the low flow and the high flow years, you can see Big Creek and Reese and Washington, San Juan, these are all first order streams at the headwaters. They're still very closely alike between those 2 years, and they're all reference. So I liked how those grouped very closely together. But for the rest of it, it's random. Nothing stands out. And when I look at the statistics, we didn't have any sites there that were undetermined. They were either reference or impaired, but none of the statistics go, wow, that's something that I should be thinking about in terms of flow with reference condition. Not a lot of sites in the Lahontan Plains, again, very low elevation, mainly the main stem of the Humboldt, more water coming out of the Humboldt River than going in. And there's nothing there to tell me that I should be thinking about the statistics in the lower Lahontan. As a matter of fact, it confuses me more. There's other things I need to be looking at in terms of the impaired sites than its flow. It's not flow, it's something else. So what does all this mean? Well, it's confusing to me, and so it's probably confusing to you. But I still think that segregating ecoregions is a valid idea. I think that given the geology and the precipitation patterns in a particular area, it's a good idea for Nevada to segregate those ecoregions. And here's another big dumb moment. As long as there's water, there's variation of reference conditions, of course. But drought conditions, by this analysis, is not saying that that reflects reference condition scores. And elevation does not necessarily influence reference condition, but there is some play there, especially if we're thinking about the Humboldt Basin. Again, the main stem, heavily utilized, is going to have more impaired sites as opposed to the higher elevation first order, second order streams. So until next time, now that you are all as confused as I am, I only have a 3 or 4 month long field season. The rest of the time I spend at my desk analyzing this, playing with data. And so last year when I talked about developing a score of ecological integrity, I want to incorporate the physical habitat into that as well. So I will continue to work on that. Nevada is going to start investigating a periphyton multimetric indice and plan for the 2014 field season when I'm happy again. We'll complete our national rivers and stream sites and do Nevada specific sampling. And here are my interns and myself on the beautiful Virgin River. It's 112 degrees with 30-mile-an-hour winds. And, but when you can get to southern Nevada, it's always fun. So with that, I will be happy to attempt to answer any questions. Put your arms in the air. Are you serious? I know I did not kill that. Oh, yes, right on.
Why do you think that is? Is it because of the insect adaptations and numerous cohorts? Why aren't you having any statistical variation?
Actually, a literature review, going through looking at different literatures, showed that drought really wasn't affecting it, that a lot of insects were able to escape to pools. And this really is based on community structure and abundance, and so sometimes some taxa that does better in drought conditions, more tolerant of drought conditions, are going to be more abundant. You know, when you think, okay, if the river's dry, there's no insects, right? But even a literature review did not find anything definitive that made me go, I'm on the right track, I'm on the wrong track. It's still, like all good science, this requires further study. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I work in forested systems, and we have what we call class 3s, and those are dry a lot, and the things emerge and start acting, I mean, really odd, in odd patterns because of drought years. So I would say just because it's dry, you know, they are there, they're just not emerging.
Right. Oh, come on, Rafi. Question from you makes it my day.
Did you see any impact of the Didymo on the macroinvertebrate communities?
Oh, yes. The Lamoille Creek for the past 2-3 years has been 100% coverage. And until we get an awesome water year to wash that away, it's, it breaks my heart because I'm a trout conservationist, and I know how it got there is on those felt waders. So anybody who is using felt waders, stop it. So yeah, it's 100% coverage, and it's up at the headwaters.
Is it affecting the bug community?
Well, actually from the bug community last year, and I would have assumed that it would have had a very deleterious effect, right? And so I expected my sample from last summer to come back to be impaired, and it was reference condition, but just a little bit above impaired. It was 0.8, and for that area, it was like 0.75 for impaired. So darn close to being impaired. Should be impaired, right? Yeah. Yes?
What was the difference between the MMI and the ODE models that made you choose the MMI?
Well, when they developed the models, when Utah State developed the models, they found that the ODE was not as sensitive as the MMI, and that's why I used the MMI for this sort of kicking the can around analysis. I think in Nevada we have a lot of endemic species, and even when I spoke with Chuck Hawkins and Jake Vanderland, they couldn't really account for why the ODE was not as sensitive as the MMI. And I think the ODE would actually be better for something like this because that includes the environmental parameters as opposed to the biotic indices. I love questions.
For the algae index, are you planning to use diatoms and soft algae or just diatoms?
Well, we have both identified. Do you have a suggestion? Yeah.
We just published a paper on the algae IBI in Southern California, and so we used several different combinations, soft algae only, diatoms only, and a combination of both.
So we do have one that was developed kind of for the Truckee River back in 2006, and the person who developed that, Clint Davis, is now working at University of Nevada, Reno, and so he will work with me because my specialty with periphyton is very limited. So we take it, so why not use both? But I would love to look at your paper. Thank you.
It sounded like you identified sites as either reference or impaired. Was there an in-between medium category?
There is an undetermined category that is comes out in the MMI indice, the predictive model. There is an undetermined.
So is that where it's not clear whether it's on the threshold of reference or impaired?
Right, and when I look at the numbers, I can see how close it is to reference or how close it is to impaired based on the values.
It seems like it'd be interesting to look at sort of a good, fair, poor framework with some of this data, rather than just a binary good or bad.
Absolutely, I agree. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody.